Okay, well, in that case, I'd like to introduce this evening's speaker. Bill Brusilow has been a PRISM since 2014. He's the current president and actually has been president for almost 2 years now as we've pushed as we've extended all the officers a second year. I grew up on the East Coast. I grew up in Baltimore, went to school on the East Coast, went to Princeton, got my PhD at Wisconsin, postdoc at Stanford, and I was a professor at University of Maryland for 6 years before moving to Wayne State over 30 years ago. And I was in the biochemistry department at Wayne State for 30 years, retiring as full professor, and I'm now emeritus professor there. I still have an office and a small laboratory that I can use as soon as my elbow gets better and the COVID clears up. My work was on bioenergetics, and later in my career, I studied inflammation. I married a woman that I met here in Michigan, Cindy. We've been married for 24 years. And we have 3 children, 2 sons, Nick and Sam, both graduated from college, and the daughter, Isabel, who's a junior up at Northern Michigan. And as I said, I've been at PRISM since 2014, really have enjoyed it. And looking forward to seeing everybody at the club. Hopefully next week if I get a bunch of negative tests, but certainly in the next couple of weeks or so. Okay, now let's see if let me share my screen here. My talk, I wanted to give, I've always given talks on kind of the history of science, the development of, say, discovery of vitamins, or development of polio vaccine, or development of penicillin. And I thought I'd give hopefully not a very long talk tonight about a subject that I always find kind of curious and interesting, and that is the distribution of water resources in the country and how populations react to that or don't react to it. And it's, I think it's kind of timely because it's related in part, not completely, but it's related in part to the growing problem with climate dysfunction, not just in the United States, but around the world. But that's related to a general drying out of parts of this country, and at the same time, making other parts even wetter. So let's see what I can do here with sharing screen. Sharing screen. Can I share a screen? Okay. Sharing options. Nope. Can somebody who knows how to do this tell? Here we go. How about this one? Can somebody see? You guys see that?
Yes, you're starting to share your screen.
Okay. Okay. Let's. This is a PowerPoint presentation that hopefully I can actually start from beginning, from current slide. Not happening. I'm sharing screen, but I can't open the slideshow. I guess I can do it like this, but there's got to be a way of actually getting a full screen, right?
Yeah, Bill, we can't see what you're sharing here at the club right now. We see a screen that says that you've started sharing, but we can't see anything that you are sharing. Okay.
How about that? What's going on here?
No. Oh, wait a second. There we go. We can see it now.
Okay, let me see if I can. Okay, this is a drought map. The first couple of slides are drought maps in the United States, with the yellow and the brown and the purple colors indicating more and more severe drought. And this one shows, as we all know, the southwest of the United States is in drought. And the next slide shows an updated, a more recent drought monitor from just a few days ago, again showing that the western part of the country is experiencing a drought, and parts of it are experiencing a very, very severe drought. And even though these slides are just snapshots of one day, what it looks like one day, and obviously any day or any week or any month can show different rain conditions or different drought conditions. In fact, the drought on the western half of the United States has been going on for a couple of decades. And the third slide just shows the general drought considerations of the whole Western United States, basically west of the Rocky Mountains for the past 20 years. And
Hey,
again,
Bill,
you can
hey, Bill, start your presentation by clicking on the upper left-hand corner, start the presentation from beginning, and then we'll see it full screen.
I'm only seeing full screen right now, Dave. I don't even see the PowerPoint.
We're seeing your first slide.
Okay, from the beginning, hang on, let me go.
Click that,
Okay.
and I think you're good.
Is that it? Can you guys see full screen? Can anybody hear me?
You had a good start, so do that again. Click from the beginning, and then start processing the slide with your left and right arrow.
Okay, hang on. From the beginning. And start there. Did everyone see the full screen?
Not yet.
I'm looking at it here. Okay.
Or just manually move down and click to your second and third slide on the left-hand side.
How about now? Is full slide yet? I'm clicking through it. Is anyone seeing this?
We're just seeing your first slide, and you're on the left-hand side, we're seeing the icons for your
Okay.
other slides.
Meeting controls, screen sharing, share. Okay, is this okay? Can we go with this?
Sure. You're on the first slide, and that's all we're seeing.
Okay. Second slide now.
Yes.
Okay, so here's the drought monitor again, as I said, but if we look at the last 20 years of Western drought, you can see that the drought has been pervasive for 20 years with a few yearly exceptions. It was bad in the early 2000s, 2006 not so bad, then 2006 to 11, things were drying out, 11 not so bad, then there was this big tough, about 5 years of really severe drought out west, and we all remember seeing pictures of Squaw Valley with no snow on it. And they got a little respite in 2017, but the drought is back now, and really severe drought and now they're experiencing very severe drought. So this is what's happened out in the Western United States. But, you know, curiously enough, or interestingly enough, at the same time that the West has been drying out, the East has been getting wetter. And in fact, the climatologists, the people who study climate over the country, have told us for a long time that the development or the movement of population from the East to the West in the early part or in the last century correlated with unusually wet weather in the 1900s out West, that the normal weather pattern much, much drier than that. And that what we have seen for the past couple of decades might well be a return to normal weather patterns. And if we look at the difference in rainfall between the west of the Rocky Mountains and east of the Rocky Mountains, you can see this, that the green indicates increased, green and blue indicates increased amounts of rainfall over the past 30 years. And the brown sections and dark brown sections show decreased amounts of rainfall over the past 30 years. So I've always found this kind of an interesting question. We get these differences in amounts of water and amounts of rainfall, and how they might influence where people live, and how they might influence how governments, local and municipal, local and federal agencies might respond in terms of trying to share water between sections, between parts of the country, either local parts of the country or over the whole country, to try to respond to these conditions, these drought conditions in some places and too much water in other places. Now, if we look at Western states, Well, first of all, let's look at the East. The East has lots of sources of water, right? We have the Great Lakes, for crying out loud, 50% of all the freshwater, non-frozen water on Earth. We also have these gigantic rivers, the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, Hudson River. There are lots and lots of places for people in the eastern parts of the United States to get their water, not so much in the West. If you look out West, what do we have? We have rainfall and snowpack. And we know from just looking at the measurements that the amount of rain has been going down for the past 20 years. And we also know that the amount of snowpack has been going down because, after all, snow is just precipitation in the winter. And that's particularly bad because the snowpack in the mountains of both the Rockies and the Sierra Nevadas act as reservoirs for water out west. That as the snow builds up, the water is stored there. As the weather warms up in the spring and summer, the snow thaws, the water melts, fills the streams and rivers, and provides water for all the things that people need. And things are so dry right now out west that the snowpack is very light, and it's small enough, and things are dry enough, the ground is dry enough that when the snow melts, the water, instead of running into the streams and rivers, just gets absorbed by the dry land. So it's a real problem in terms of rainfall and snowpack out west right now. There are a couple of major rivers a lot of rivers, but a couple of major rivers out there. The most predominant one, of course, is the Colorado River. The Colorado River starts, now can everyone see my cursor? Can anyone see my cursor?
Yes.
Okay. Starts at the headwaters of the Colorado River are a series of lakes, several lakes in northern Colorado, which collect the rain and snowfall off the mountains into these lakes. It runs through Colorado, Utah, down into Arizona. And this water is widely used. It's probably the most used river for water, or the most, I forget the right word for it. It's a river that is basically all the water in that river is allocated to various municipal sources and agricultural sources, so that it's governed by the Colorado River Compact, I think it's called, that was signed in 1922 by the states around the Colorado that used this river. They made this compact after a period of unusually high rainfall and unusually high flow in the Colorado River. So the Colorado River has basically been over allocated since 1922. And the term people use is that there's a lot of paper water in this river. Water that exists only on paper. It never exists in the river. It never exists for people to use. Nonetheless, everybody has their share of the Colorado, of the real water and of the paper water. So the Colorado River serves the needs of 40 million people. 40 million people, and on top of that, most of the use is for agriculture. So enormous amount is used for agriculture, and a large amount is used for people as well. And the Colorado River is controlled by the two biggest reservoirs in the country. Those reservoirs are behind the Hoover Dam, Lake Mead behind the Hoover Dam, and Lake Powell behind the Glen Canyon Dam, which were put in place as giant reservoirs to control the flow of water, for the allocation of water for people and agriculture. And also both these dams have significant hydroelectric plants in them. So an enormous amount of energy is generated by the flow of the Colorado from the mountains down through all these states, and ultimately through Arizona, and ultimately out in Southern California. And I forget, does it go out in Southern California or Mexico? I think it might actually leave somewhere right around the California-Mexico border into the ocean, but in fact, almost no water actually gets to the ocean. It's all allocated. And as you might imagine, as you probably know, as a result of these drought conditions over the last 20 years, the flow in the Colorado River has reached some of the lowest levels ever. And in fact, it has triggered a meeting between the states of the Colorado Collective, or the Colorado Agreement, the Colorado River has gotten so low, and the amount of water in the Hoover, in Lake Mead and Lake Powell, this slide is from 2014, but right now, both of these reservoirs, the two biggest reservoirs in the whole country, are running at about 30% capacity. That's too low. They're going to have to cut their hydroelectric power, and those levels of those reservoirs have triggered cuts in allocation of the Colorado River to the various people who have had this river water for 100 years. And those negotiations have just started and are apparently ongoing or about to start. There has been no agreement about who's going to get cut, how much they're going to get cut. And you can imagine how acrimonious those meetings might become, because not only do we have 40 million people, but we have an enormous amount of agriculture and agribusiness that depends upon the Colorado River. And they're all going to have to make concessions because the water is just not there now. The other large river out west is up north, the Columbia River, which goes through British Columbia, largely in Washington, a little bit in Oregon. This is a significant river. Obviously, the Columbia River is in fact about 3 times as large in terms of water flow as the Colorado River. And sometimes there are proposals, or people out west, especially in California, speak out and say, well, why can't we divert some of the Columbia River down to California? And of course, that's a non-starter politically for anybody who's in the Columbia River Basin in taking that water. In addition, there is another mountain range between Oregon and California, somewhere in Northern California, that water would have to be piped over. So even though they're in a drought condition too, as far as I can tell, the people out there seem to think the Columbia River is going to be okay for the next year or so, but they are worried if these conditions continue. And the last source of Western water are the that I want to talk about are the aquifers. Aquifers are not lakes, they're not rivers, they are groundwater. They're underground pools of water, large deposits of water that accumulate over very long periods of time. And there are 2 gigantic aquifers out west that are important for the delivery of water to those western states. And needless to say, they're both understretched. The first is the Central Valley Aquifer, Central Valley of California. This aquifer, this water is laid down, water running off the San Andreas, the California mountain range here, and they and it just builds up over time, and it's deposited underneath the Central Valley, and it's quite large and quite long, and it's basically considered 3 parts: a southern part, a middle part, and a northern part. And this aquifer contains something like, where do I have it here? This aquifer contains, let me get this thing out of the way, about 800 million acre feet of water in the aquifer. And just to compare that to bodies of water we're more familiar with, there are 800 million acre feet in this aquifer. Lake Superior contains 9,800 million acre feet, about 12 times as much. So it's a lot of water, but it's not a great lake. And this aquifer, over the past 10 years since its discovery and use for not just for water for people and for farms, largely for farms, it's been depleted about 10%. And that doesn't sound bad, except that what farms are doing in the Central Valley is they dig their wells and they pump the water out and they use it to water their crops, which means that the level of the aquifer, even though only 10% is gone, is constantly dropping. And as it drops below the pipes for different municipalities and farms, pumps and wells, which means that once the aquifer level is below the level of your well pipe, you don't have any water. It doesn't matter to you that 90% of the aquifer is left. You can't get any out of that well, which means people and farms are constantly drilling new and deeper and more expensive wells to get the water out of this aquifer. And that's a problem because it becomes very expensive, and the smaller, less wealthy farms and municipalities just can't keep up. So there are places in California that are basically run out of water. They can't get any water out of the aquifer. They have to rely on whatever water's in the streams or rivers, and there aren't that many rivers in this part of California. So the aquifer is stressed and continues to be stressed. And I find it interesting that a body of water that's so important to California and agriculture, and we've all heard the numbers about how much produce, how much produce is produced in the Central Valley of California and shipped everywhere, that California has no policy about this. You're free to do whatever you want. So basically the rich get richer and they get the water, and the poor people with the shallower wells just can't keep up. So constant drilling and aquifer depletion has also led to subsidence of the Central Valley by as much as 28 feet. So the land has actually dropped 20 or 30 feet in the Central Valley. And aquifers don't recharge. They don't recharge in any kind of normal time frame. So this will continue, and they have no policy, and there's no sign, as far as I can tell, of them instituting any policy to try to say, hey, let's take it easy draining this water out of the aquifer. They're just going to keep doing it full speed ahead. The other aquifer that is really important for Western water is on the other side of the Rocky Mountains. That's the so-called Ogallala Aquifer. The Ogallala Aquifer is shown here underneath Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, a little bit in South Dakota and Wyoming. And this aquifer was discovered back in the late 1800s. And again, it's the result of runoff for thousands and thousands of years, runoff from the Rocky Mountains that doesn't go into main rivers, but goes into the soil and drops down and forms this gigantic underground lake. And if you drive I-80 across Nebraska into Wyoming or into Colorado, you're driving over, I figured it's like 500 feet or 1,000 feet. You're driving over one of the most gigantic bodies of water in the country, the Ogallala Aquifer. It underlies 175,000 square miles. It includes 27% of all the irrigated land in the United States. So a quarter of all the irrigated land is dependent upon water sources that significantly include this aquifer. In 1980, it had 3,250 million acre feet. So that's about 4 times as much as the Central Valley Aquifer. And since 1950, it has been depleted by about 10%, but the rate of depletion is accelerating as we get this general drying out of the country. More and more of the aquifer is being used for the water needs of the people and farms that people who live there and the farms that live there. And as you know, there aren't that many people living there. There are only about 2.5 million people represented in this area of the aquifer, and about 80% of them depend upon the aquifer for water. So it's not really so much human needs as the aquifer is for agricultural needs. So so both these aquifers are being depleted. They're being depleted relatively rapidly. I mean, kids born today will easily live to see the time that both the Central Valley Aquifer and the Ogallala Aquifer will become so small as to be almost useless for farming needs or human needs. And that's kind of the key. Right now, people think they're okay. Look, there's still water there. We're still pumping it. There's no real planning. Like in California, there's no real planning for, hey, what are we going to do when this thing runs out? The Ogallala Aquifer, once it's dry, will take over 6,000 years to replenish to the state it was in when people first found it and started using it. Okay, so that's the situation out west, right? We have a drying out country. The major rivers, the Colorado River is overallocated, and they're going to have to redo their allocations. Nobody's going to be happy about that. Lake Powell and Lake Mead are at their all-time lowest levels. They're lower, they're as low as they've ever been. They're as low as they were, maybe lower than they were when the Hoover Dam and the Glen Canyon Dam were first built, and the aquifers are drying out. So you look at this and say, well, that's obviously that's not a good long-term situation. On the eastern half of the United States, there's plenty of water, whether it's the Mississippi or the Great Lakes or all the other rivers, and there's lots of water all over the east. So what are people going to do? What's going to happen with the people and this, I won't say civilizations, the municipalities and all the farms that are out west, but are relying on a diminishing source of water? You think, well, people are going to see this and start making decisions with their feet and say, okay, well, maybe I won't move to California, maybe I won't move to Arizona. And if you thought that, you of course would be wrong. In a post this week for the Economic Innovation Group, this guy calculated that the driest group of communities in the Southwest averaged a total of 245 weeks in severe drought between January 2010 and July 2021. Okay, so that's 4 to 5 years of drought, constant drought in those 10 or 11 years. But over the same time, those places added nearly 7.4 million people, increasing their population by 10%. Whereas counties in the Northeast and the Midwest that spent less than a year cumulatively in severe drought grew by only 5.7 million residents. And population projections are that this trend will continue. People are going to continue to move out west. So I thought, well, that means that they've got to get the water somewhere, which means that, as we occasionally hear in the Great Lakes region, that the western states want to get water from the Mississippi or from the Great Lakes. So I started looking into, is that actually true? Are there any projects proposed? Are there any actual projects proposed for moving water from where there's a lot of water to places where there's not much water? And surprisingly enough, there's really not that much in terms of moving water all the way to the other side of the Rocky Mountains. There's the occasional weird letter or strange letter in the Los Angeles paper saying something like, well, the Great Lakes, they have this Great Lakes Consortium with the 8 states and the 2 provinces, Canadian provinces. So what we have to do here in Los Angeles or California, we have to get that consortium, all 8 states and all the 2 provinces. So first of all, we have to get them to agree to allow large water diversion to California. And then the letter would go on, second of all, at which point I say, what do you mean second of all? You're never going to get all 8 states. The Great Lakes Consortium has been pretty good in terms of withdrawals from the Great Lakes Basin, in terms of keeping large-scale withdrawals out of the Great Lake basins. That's never going to happen. We're never going to get the Great Lakes states and the Canadian states to agree to any significant water diversion, especially given the fact, and apparently this annoys Canada a little bit, that 120 years ago, there was the Chicago diversion where the Chicago River was made to run backwards. So we're actually draining water out of the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River as it is. There are going to be no more grand diversions. If you look at, so politically, it's a non-starter moving that much water from either the Mississippi River or the Great Lakes. Additionally, it's extremely expensive. It's really expensive to move water from one place to another. It's water. It's not oil. It's not gas. People use a lot of water. Farms use a lot of water. You'd have to have these enormous pipes. So I did look at what projects are out there, and there are a number of projects proposed to divert the Missouri River. This is all the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains, the Missouri River to the Dakotas, for example, to try to get more water there. Not so much not so much to take pressure off the Ogallala Aquifer, but just to provide a little more water to the western, to the eastern side of the Rocky Mountains. Okay, so the reason that we can't have these large water diversions, and we'll probably never have them, is first of all, there's no grand overseeing agency that's responsible for making sure everybody has enough water and being able to negotiate with these various entities and municipalities to move water from one place to another. That sort of thing just doesn't exist. There is, of course, the Colorado River agreement, the states that agree that have set up the Colorado River allocation, and we have the Great Lakes Consortium, the Great Lakes Compact, and those agencies deal with the Colorado River or the Great Lakes, but there's no kind of an overriding thing. It's like in California. California has no agency that says, look, we have to slow down depletion of this aquifer because, you know, in 50 years, we're going to be toast in terms of getting water out of that. So first of all, there's no agency, there's no organizing agency. Second of all, local politics is everything here. People in the Great Lakes, like us, we consider, and I consider that to be our water. People in the Mississippi consider it to be their water. We don't want our water going to Arizona. Mississippi people along the Mississippi don't want their water going to Arizona or California. So those two reasons. And the third reason is it's just really expensive and it'd be very hard to figure out who's actually going to pay for this. So given the fact that I really couldn't find any pipeline projects that took water from the east all the way to the west, I decided to invent a few of my own. And I thought, okay, let's think of 3 different pipeline projects, the Brusilow projects for moving water from Great Lakes or Mississippi out west. And before doing that, I thought, well, let me figure out how to calculate how much this is going to cost. And I looked around at different projects that are actually in the works, and I made guesses, probably not such great guesses, but guesses about extrapolating between those costs and costs of gigantic pipeline projects. Okay, so here's my crude estimates. Here's my methodology. The top line shows the Lake Huron-Flint pipeline project that was put in after the Flint water crisis. That takes water directly from Lake Huron right across the thumb directly to Flint. It's about 70 miles. It costs $600 million. And there are about 400,000 people in Genesee County. I don't know if all 400,000 are getting that water, but let's say all 400,000 get that water. That's about $20 per mile per person. So if you want to have 1 million people, it would be about $20 million per mile to make the same pipeline service 1 million people. Okay, now, but that's got to be the simplest pipeline in the world. I have not consulted. I assume that Rod Keyes is the Prismatic Club geographer and cartographer and whatever, but so I failed to consult him, but I'm pretty sure there are no major mountain ranges between Lake Huron and Flint, Michigan, nor are there any significant valleys there. Excuse me. This has got to be the simplest pipeline in the world. Simplest and cheapest pipeline. There's another pipeline in the works, the Lake Powell pipeline, which is actually very contentious right now because it's been planned for years and the people in Utah are expecting their pipeline from Lake Powell. This goes 140 miles for only 160,000 people, and the cost is $2.4 billion. That comes out to a little over 100 miles, $100 per mile per person, and it goes up 2,000 feet. It's got 2,000 feet elevation as opposed to the Lake Huron Flint pipeline, which is there's no change in elevation. So the rise of 2,000 feet increases the cost about 5-fold. So that I'm making the assumption for these projects I'm going to propose that every 2,000 foot rise increases the price by 5-fold. So 2,000 feet, 5-fold increase, 4,000 feet, 10-fold, 6,000 feet, 15-fold. Probably not right, but you got to use some methodology here, and that's the one I'm using. So everyone understand what I'm doing here? This is how I'm going to calculate cost. Here are my 3 proposed pipelines, none of which will ever be built, of course, but just an exercise. 1, transfer of water from Lake Superior to the headwaters of the Colorado River through South Pass, Wyoming. That's right here. If we start at Duluth, Minnesota, David, start at Duluth, Minnesota, and you go from Duluth to South Pass, which is the lowest pass in the Northern Rockies. Duluth is about 700 feet, South Pass, Wyoming is about 7,400 feet. I took this map off of a road map, but you could obviously make it straighter. And if you straighten it out, it's close to 1,000 miles from Duluth to South Pass, and you're going up about 7,000 feet in elevation, and it's 1,000 miles, 7,000 feet up in elevation. So once you get to South Pass, you're on the other side of the Rockies. You're very close to the lakes that make up the headwaters of the Colorado River. So basically, most of the work is done getting through South Pass, and then it's only 50 or 100 miles to pour water into those lakes that eventually end up in the Colorado River. Okay, so let's use our Flint Lake Huron estimate for 1,000 miles at $20,000 per person. If you go 1,000 miles, that gives us $20 billion to provide water for 1 million people. Okay, that's for 1 million people, but you want to get enough water so you have more than 1 million people. Let's say you want to get enough water to help out 10 million people. So that'll be 200 billion. But that's using the Flint pipeline, which is, there's no elevation. If you have to go up 7,000 feet, you've got to increase by at least 20 times, 15 to 20 times, which means this pipeline theoretically would cost $400,000 per person, or $400 billion per million people, and for 10 million people be $4 trillion. Okay, so $4 trillion seems like a lot of money. That's to build a pipeline to get across the Rockies and refill the headwaters of the Colorado River. The second pipeline project is transfer from the Mississippi River to Ogallala to take pressure off the Ogallala Aquifer. That would be right here, sorry. Let's say we go into Mississippi at Davenport, Iowa. Now it's only about 625 miles to Ogallala, and it goes up about 3,000 feet, a little less than 3,000 feet. That price tag is, using my low estimate, is about $12.5 billion for 1 million people. Now you're sending it out there for agricultural interest, so it's going to be a little more than that. But this is not the most horrible number you've ever seen. 12.5 billion. But that's our low estimate. We're going up about almost 3,000 feet. So instead of 12.5 thousand dollars per person, make it about $100,000 per person. And now you're going about $100 billion per million people. And maybe to keep the pressure off the Ogallala, to try to provide some water so they don't tap into the Ogallala so much, maybe a couple hundred billion dollars. That's not awful, I think. And the third project is the transfer from Mississippi River to Arizona and Southern California, which is right here. I call this the Grapes of Wrath Route 66 from St. Louis to Flagstaff, because you would take water out of Mississippi at St. Louis, and you basically send it down a route along the old Route 66, which I think is like 54 now. I don't think 66 is really there anymore. But this is the pathway of the Okies during the Dust Bowl. from Missouri and Oklahoma through Texas, through New Mexico, into Arizona, and the highest point on that route is Flagstaff, Arizona, about 7,300 feet. So you go from 460 to 7,300. We do the same analysis. How much does it cost to build this using our low estimate? It's about 27 billion per million people. High estimate, since we're going up 7,000 feet, 1,350 miles, about 500 billion per million people. Once you're at Flagstaff, it's pretty much all downhill. There are some other passes to go through, but it's more or less downhill to Phoenix and to Tucson, and then into California, into the southern end of the Central Valley of California. And that would cost more, but I'm just thinking about this main pipeline. So for 1 billion people, that's $500 million. For 10 million people, that's again $5 trillion. So it's a lot of money, and that's why people don't propose these things. It just, from an engineering point of view, you can actually do this. You can build these pipelines. You can build the pumps to get them over the mountains. You can do it, but it's incredibly expensive. And these numbers, these kind of strange estimates I've come up with, are just the numbers to build them, not the numbers to operate them, not the energy it takes to pump the water, move the water, or what it takes to maintain these things. So nobody actually proposes these kinds of pipelines because of that. Politics are terrible. You're never going to get anybody to agree to this, and it's going to be unbelievably expensive. Just as a side note to this, before moving on, this Ogallala one, there was a proposal back in the 70s to move water from the Great Lakes to the Ogallala Aquifer to do exactly this. They didn't take it from the Mississippi River, they took it from the Great Lakes, I don't know exactly where. And they and the Army Corps of Engineers in 1982 reviewed it and decided not to go forward with it. I don't know exactly why, but probably they ran the numbers and said, well, this is doable, but it's really, really expensive. And after all, it's Ogallala, and there's probably not a lot of lobbying influence out in western Nebraska and eastern Wyoming and Colorado. So those are my three theoretical and impossible scenarios for giant pipelines. So let's finish. I want to finish up the talk with two pipelines that actually were proposed, two gigantic pipeline projects that actually were proposed. One was proposed as the Grand Canal of North America, 1959, by Thomas Kierans. And he was concerned, and as I said, right around 1960, Canada was very concerned with the state of the Great Lakes. Chicago was draining off water, and in fact, in 59, 60, they expanded that drain into the Chicago River, so they started taking more water. So Canada was concerned about the amount of water in the Great Lakes, and that was a very low period for the Great Lakes. You can find other reports from the early 60s saying Lake Superior was at an all-time low. So they were concerned about the water in the Great Lakes, the amount and the quality. And he was looking at data like these. This shows overall rainfall distribution in North America. And you can see the different colors show, for example, in the Arctic, gets about 10% of the rainfall and precipitation, probably a lot of snow. The Hudson Bay, the Pacific, from Alaska all the way down through California and Colorado, gets about 25% of snow and rain. The Atlantic region, which includes the Great Lakes and the coastal provinces of Canada, get about 28% of the rain. And the central part of the United States gets about 16%, which drains to the Gulf of Mexico. Excuse me. But Kierans looked at this, or what was his name? Kierans looked at this and said, look at all this stuff going out in the Hudson Bay. 20% of all the rainfall in North America falls on an area that contains less than 1% of the people. So what can we do about that? And he was concerned about these items on the right, about declining levels in the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Great Lakes. The Hudson Bay concerns are kind of invented, excess fresh water, they can't have a fishery. That kind of sounds like bullshit to me. I don't think anybody bought that. But what can we do to capture some of this water? And his proposal was, oh goodness, where is it? And his proposal was to build a dam across James Bay. Here's James Bay, the lower end of the Hudson Bay, to build a dam here, have this whole area fill up with fresh water, and then build a canal from James Bay to Georgian Bay in Lake Huron to allow for the purification and replenishment of water in the Great Lakes. That was his proposal in 1959. He actually kept advocating for this until his death in the early 2000s, I think. And his son still thinks this is a good idea and is running around advocating for this. This is not the only part of it. This is the main part of it. There were a number of other accessory canals taking this water to different places in Southern California and in parts of North America too. But this is a gigantic water project that was actually proposed, but was not ever actually implemented. And the last project, which I'll finish with, is just a remarkable project that was proposed in, now here's a problem because I want to look at my notes, and I don't know if I can look at my notes without showing them to everybody. Hang on, let me see if I can call up that one. Are people seeing the slide or seeing my notes?
The slide.
Okay, good. All right, so getting back to let me finish up this old James Bay project. Cost was estimated to be about $100 billion back in 1959. The plan was actually discussed, but never moved on because the US and Canadian governments just refused to enter into a large-scale cooperative international water sharing arrangement at that time. Obviously, this plan does nothing for the Western US. The biggest proposal for water allocation was made in 1961 by Ralph Parsons, who was a wealthy founder of a successful engineering firm. He made a proposal that would deal with all the water problems in North America, the entire continent, in one fell swoop. His proposal, called Nawapa, the North American Water and Power Alliance. This was a continent-wide proposal. A series of dams would occur. Let's move this out of the way. Here is Nawapa. A series of dams would occur on different rivers throughout North America, but largely over here on the left-hand side in the Yukon and other waters of Western Canada, and putting dams on the headwaters of the Yukon, the Copper, the Kootenai, the Fraser, the Peace, and Columbia rivers to divert their flows into reservoirs. Included in these was damming the 500-mile-long Rocky Mountain Trench, a natural formation which would have 16 times the capacity of Lake Mead. The Rocky Mountain Trench is this enormous structure that extends from Montana all the way north through Canada, almost to Alaska. From the Rocky Mountain Trench, okay, so here's the Rocky Mountain Trench right here. They would pull water out of the trench and divert it down south into Idaho, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, Nevada, south into California, over through Arizona, into New Mexico, and would use this water to provide water for all the western states. At the same time, canals will be built on the Peace River that will connect it to this gigantic reservoir in the Rocky Mountain Trench and to various waterways extending all the way east to Lake Superior, and not shown on this one, but there would be waterways connecting this reservoir to Vancouver. So you will be able to take a boat from Vancouver to Lake Superior through the North American Water and Power Alliance. And he also included some of this stuff in the Grand Canal, taking water not from James Bay, but taking the rivers that fed James Bay and using those to feed water into the Great Lakes. So what we ended up with is this is not what I'm looking for.
Go to the next slide.
Hang on. I'm just trying to access my notes here because I don't control the slide, so I can't control the notes. I'm trying to find my notes. I'm almost done, believe it or not. Just got to find my notes.
Just fake it.
Fine. Yeah, that's what I've been doing for the past 5 minutes. Okay, so Nawapa would require the construction of 369 dams, canals, pipelines, tunnels, and pumping stations. Its builders would move 32 billion cubic yards of earth and 30 million tons of steel. The largest proposed dam would be 1,700 feet tall, more than twice the height of the Hoover Dam. They estimated the project will cost between 100 and 200 billion over 30 years, or in today's dollars, somewhere between 760 billion and 1.5 trillion. I expect that's a significant underestimate. The implementation of Nawapa, now this was a real proposal that was really considered. It has not been considered since, this came out in the early 60s, it hasn't really been considered seriously since the 1970s, even though in the late 70s, it was advocated by Lyndon LaRouche of all people. The interesting thing to me about Nawapa is that in terms of water, in terms of the water problems of the West and the country and North America in general, this thing would actually work. It's engineering-wise, it's feasible. It would be unbelievably expensive, but water would, and it would be an ecological and environmental catastrophe. But it would actually work. So it's interesting that somebody actually thought of a way to do this. This slide shows the space view of the Rocky Mountain Trench in Canada. For reference, Calgary is right here. So Nawapa is, as envisioned by them, the system will deliver 120 million acre feet to US, Canada, and Mexico. It would enable Mexico to triple irrigated acreage, add more acreage to the US and Canada, would generate, because of all the power plants that would be built here, 70 million kilowatts of power. And he estimated it would cost 100 to 200 billion. In $89 is 339 billion. In current dollars, probably several trillion. So that's the conclusion of the talk. And I put this together just because I think it's interesting. There's a potential water crisis. It's too easy to use the word crisis, but there's certainly a long-term problem with water out west. People are thinking about it, but there are no solutions being proposed. Those of us here say, well, those people should just move back here to the Midwest where there's plenty of water, and I certainly feel that way. But we know that's not really going to happen until something really dramatic occurs. And there are people, you know, I don't have no sympathy for people who, even though I know them, people who have moved from Michigan to Arizona for retirement. I mean, things are getting very hot in the summer, and they still have water, but their water is under stress. But I do have sympathy for people who were born there, have generations living in Arizona and the Central Valley of California, that really have no other place to live and no other life. And yet it just seems like it's one of these problems that's it's not even clear it's addressable, but it doesn't seem to me it's even being addressed at all. So I will conclude with that, and thank you for your time.
Bravo. Stop screen sharing and we can have some fun with questions.
Stop screen share. Okay, stop share. Right, got it.
Bill, do you want to take any questions?
If anybody has questions, I'll be happy to answer. But you know, the thing about this whole water situation is we all kind of all know this, but it's happening anyway. But sure, if anybody has questions, I'll be happy to. Yeah.
Actually, I have a contribution. When I was living in Calgary in the 1980s, a guy out there had what I thought was a really cool idea. The Klamath River in Oregon discharges a huge volume of water into the ocean, and it stays fresh for many miles out into the ocean. So he had the idea of building a gigantic Kevlar bag and filling it up with fresh water more than 12 miles offshore, where it was in international waters, towing it down to San Diego with ocean-going tugs and selling the water to San Diego. And he actually got a contract with San Diego to buy the water from him. And he was starting to build his Kevlar bag when this became sort of publicly known. And for reasons that I have never understood, the environmental organizations went berserk and succeeded in blocking it. He had to abandon the idea.
I did read about that proposal, yes.
It seemed really cool.
I have a question.
We are,
It all deals with fresh water, right? No?
Bill, this all deals with fresh water, right?
It's all fresh water, yes.
Look at the cost of diverting all our wastewater to out west.
Well, you know, I mean, that's what they're doing. And Los Angeles has actually been very, very proactive with water storage and recycling water and cleaning their wastewater. I mean, there are municipalities, and Los Angeles is probably one of the prime examples, where they really don't feel any major problems right now because they are very diligent about not letting any fresh water get away.
I'd like to do a couple of things. One is to, I mean, first, this is a brilliant presentation, but before I continue on that, Bill and the executive committee have carried on through 2 years of probably some of the more challenging times of our existence with COVID and Zoom meetings and everything else. And Bill has been an incredible leader of our organization and a good steward of everything that we stand for. And so I'd like to first salute Bill and the executive committee, but especially Bill, for everything that he has done to keep us going through this very difficult period. So congratulations and thank you. And then I want to go beyond that because, as many of you know, I live on the north shore of Lake Superior. I'm a mile through the woods to the Canadian border. I'm 10 miles north of us is the Laurentian Divide, which is where the water goes either to Hudson's Bay or to Lake Superior or the Mississippi. And we've experienced all of this stuff. We've had the driest season in 20 years. We've lived for the last 2 months with the most serious forest fire danger that we have had forever. And yet if you go down to Lake Superior, which I love and which I sail on, we're down about 24 inches over the last couple of years. And if you drive around anywhere in the North Shore of Minnesota or Wisconsin or Michigan, there's signs everywhere with big pictures of Lake Superior, which say not for sale, which means our water is sacred and it's not going anywhere. And I think politically and strategically, that's probably the case. But with Bill, I think he put some numbers on it that were just interesting and amazing, and I appreciate that.
Building pipelines is really expensive. And building them is expensive. Running them is as or more expensive.
Remember, I lived in Texas back in the 70s and 80s, when, if you remember, people were leaving Michigan there was talk of building all these huge pipelines to transfer oil up here and all this kind of stuff. And there were bumper stickers everywhere that said, "Let them freeze in the dark." And I suspect that someday we'll be seeing bumper stickers that says, "Let them fry in the West."
As an economist, the real answer for the central California aquifer and the demand in California for all that agriculture as well as people, the real issue is the price of energy, because energy is the clue to desalination.
Yeah.
Yes. You're right.
You know, the problem is, Oliver,
Can't do it with windmills.
have you ever been on a cruise ship? And you sit down, and you drink the water on the cruise ship, you notice that you sort of have the drops, because it has a very high level of magnesium, which tends to be a laxative. So if you're drinking desalinated water, you're going to lose stools.
That's what my takeaway is. Instead of spending trillions of dollars on an electric car,
Do you think
we should send our money to the state of Israel, who's top-notch technology in desalinization, and use 2/3 of the earth to give us water to Arizona or wherever the hell we want?
Yeah, you're still stuck though, because you can only desalinate, it's not economic at all, but you can only desalinate on the ocean. So what are you gonna do in Arizona? What are you gonna do in Colorado? Are you gonna pump salt water there for desalinization? You still have to move water. Still have to move a bunch of water if you're off the coast.
We haven't found a way to make the salt water into drinkable, pleasant water. I don't know.
And do we care that they have drums?